Hi friends, host Erica, who's talking with famous people. I want to respond to Karen and talk a little bit more about bias. She says, hi Eric, you say that FETI users think the bias used as an argument supposedly makes it a valid argument. Uh, Not sure if I understand you correctly, but I'll take the bait. An FETI user, I would have to disagree with that statement. I think that recognizing that a person is biased and giving credence to their argument because it is biased would be two different things. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that people give credence to the argument because it's biased. They say that your argument is not, that the reason you're wrong is because you're biased. In other words, people will say, well, like Mark here said, um, well, not in this one, but in another video, he said, well, what you're trying to do is just validate your relationship with Kimberly. Well, that might be the case, but it's not an argument. Bias is a reason why people make bad arguments, but it's not a reason why an argument is bad. That's the key distinction. So it's true that biased people are more likely to make bad arguments, but that's not a reason for you to conclude that their argument is more likely bad, because um, the specific argument itself has to be judged on its own merits, detached from the motives of the person. That's what TI is it's disinterest in that fashion. What would this? How would we determine this if nobody had any interest in it? Is the core question of TI. So, good FE will always seek to recognize and appease if possible, not necessarily agree in theory or otherwise. Recognizing motives is not the same thing as agreeing with motives. Often the motive is the underlying reason for the bias. Well, sure. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. People are motivated to make arguments for any number of reasons, but their own motivations for making those arguments is not one of the arguments themselves. And if you want to respond to what they're saying, then you need to respond to what their arguments are. I have no idea if my TI is good or bad. I can see your point is not the same thing as actually conceding the point, is it? I have no idea. No, it's not. I have no idea if my TI is good or bad. My criteria for judging an argument is sometimes logical and sometimes much more intuitive, and therefore cannot be judged in any logical way, can it? Well, sure it can. I mean, the question comes down to, you're saying, well, I'm making my own subjective judgments for my own purposes. Obviously, anyone can do that for whatever reason they want to. The issue of whether an argument is logical, quote unquote, or in other words, considered without interest, is one that is about which statements we make and which ones we agree to operate as though they were true and which ones we won't agree to operate as though they were true. So if you're a boss and your employee comes late for work and he says, "Oh, sorry, boss, I was abducted by a drug cartel and caused me to be about 15 minutes late. It took me about 15 minutes to escape from them." You're probably not going to believe that, right? And you're probably going to demand some sort of evidentiary support for that, possibly, and or draw conclusions about the person based on the fact that their claim is not likely to be true. You can intuit if you want that the person is telling the truth or that it doesn't matter to you or something like that, and then, or you could intuit that he's not telling the truth. I mean, in that instance, I would intuit that the person's probably not telling the truth or read their body language and stuff, and I wouldn't probably bother I wouldn't bother dismantling the claim, because it requires so much substantiation to be believed in the first place. And in that regard, obviously, I'd be intuiting my judgment. The issue with TI is that you're not making personal judgments at that point. I mean, you can use it to do that, but to the extent that it's out in the world and being disputed, if you're making claims that are being disputed, or if you're disputing someone else's claims, then your intuition is an inadequate warrant to substantiate a claim that you're making. In other words, well, I just intuitively think it's this way is not a good enough reason. It has to be consistent with axioms and or other established realities and stuff like that. I mean, there are ways to establish, define, defend, and make a point, and you either do it successfully or not, and it's an objective matter, you know. So I'm not saying for your own personal decision making inside your own head, obviously everyone's going to do whatever the fuck they want. But what I'm saying is, if you are having an argument out in the world, speaking it out loud, the fact that the other person is biased and has a powerful interest in being right in something is not a reason to conclude they're wrong. I mean, that's the core thing. You might conclude for your own purposes this person is unlikely to be reliable because they are very biased. But if they're making concrete points, if they're making claims and statements, then at that point their bias no longer ceases to be relevant because you need to argue with what they're saying. If I'm the head of the lettuce advisory board in charge of singing the praises of lettuce to the nation, and I point out that lettuce is a leafy green that helps you poop, that gives you refuge to make you poop more often or something, I may be incredibly biased, but what I'm saying is factually true about lettuce, right? So this is what I mean by bias is not a relevant consideration when addressing arguments. And mostly what I'm talking about is the way that people often respond to other people. So they'll say things to me a lot like, you just hate to lose, or you're just trying to win, or you're just trying to validate your relationship with Kimberly, or talking about my motivations, meaning that I ought be considered less reliable because I'm biased. That might be a valid claim to make. I mean, you can certainly make that claim and defend it, that I ought to be considered less reliable because of my bias in general. But it's not a useful claim for any specific claim I'm making. It doesn't provide you any information about any given argument that I'm actually making or any specific claim that I'm making. It's just saying that in general, when I do make claims or arguments, you should consider me less reliable because of a bias. But see, we're no longer at that stage, right? We're past the stage of, in general, if I make arguments, I am making the arguments. I'm laying it all out there for you. So you don't have to worry about my motivation anymore. If my motivation has caused me to make bad arguments, you can point out the bad arguments. Oh, Eric, you said this. That doesn't make any sense because of this. That's responding to one of my arguments by saying, see, your bias has generated a bad argument, and here it is. If you can't say, and here it is, if you're not saying your bias has generated a bad argument, then you are yourself making a bad argument because you're saying, you're biased, therefore you're unreliable, and I'm not going to respond to the arguments you're actually making. I'm going to do an ad hominem attack the person rather than the argument itself. Another example of this is a consistency fallacy where people say, well, last week you said this, though, and this time you're saying this. My previous positions, whether they are consistent or not with my current positions, are not part of my current arguments and therefore not relevant. So, this is not one I have to face very often because I'm pretty consistent in my arguments. But, it's another fallacy people often believe. Another fallacy people often believe is because something's fallacious, it's wrong. Just because a conclusion was derived fallaciously doesn't mean the conclusion itself is wrong. It just means that the reason doesn't substantiate the conclusion. So these things are critically important if we want to be serious about thinking. It's not all mush. You can't mush it all down to semantics or this or that or the other thing. Obviously, I think I must not have explained it clearly or something. Obviously, you kind of got it backwards there as to what I was saying. I was saying that bias doesn't make an invalid argument, not that it does make a valid argument. It's not really the opposite, but yeah, bias does not make an invalid argument. Bias had nothing to do with the quality of the argument. That's my point. Okay? So, I don't know if you're biased towards logic or intuition. I just think that um, you just haven't. I mean, people need to be exposed to this stuff. You know, it's like the basics of argumentation, things that I do in debate that people never learn. And they're adults and they're making arguments that trained debaters would never dream of considering making, and their kids. But because they understand that this is a mechanical, objective, determinate process, they they learn soon enough why that argument loses. Well, because this warrant here defeats it because of this reason, and there's the rhetorical slope of a given claim is inherent to it. It's like it's a culmination or some sort of something of all these different people's individual personal understandings of the words involved. So yeah, nihilism nihilism attacks people by many different paths, and some of those paths are linguistic relativist, and I negate those 100 fucking million%, and I win every time. Nobody's ever successfully argued against what I'm saying. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.